mouth of Hudson's Bay, James Bay, and at the southern tip of James Bay, the settlement of Moose Factory. News Magazine salutes Education Week with films of an Indian residential school 500 miles north of Toronto.
A devastating discovery has been made in Canada. The remains of 215 children have been found buried at the site of a former boarding school for Indigenous students. The school in British Columbia was part of a nationwide scheme that took in First Nations children in an effort to assimilate them into Canadian society. Investigations have shown there was widespread abuse. These latest findings are once again opening a wound that has yet to heal.
A great general has said that the only good Indian is a dead one, and that high sanction of his destruction has been an enormous factor in promoting Indian massacres. In a sense, I agree with this sentiment, but only in this, that all the Indian there is in the race should be dead. Kill the Indian in him and save the man. Richard Henry Pratt. I want to get rid of the Indian problem. I do not think, as a matter of fact, that the country ought to continuously protect a class of people who are able to stand alone. Our objective is to continue until there is not a single Indian in Canada that has not been absorbed. And there is no Indian question and no Indian department. Duncan Campbell Scott.
Bonjour, debet gish go kwen Indigenous gnoje conning nindonjaba, mayangan nindodam, Anishinaabe and Dao. Hello, my name is Chelsea and I come from the Bay Mills Indian community, traditionally known as Gnoje-Conning. My roots here in this community run deep with several generations of my family living here. The area in which I am standing is a giant ridge that basically lines my community, my reservation, and you can see almost the entire reservation from where I'm standing. You can also see Lake Superior and you can see Ontario, Canada as well. There are several trails up here that have been paved by Anishinaabe hundreds of years ago. Now, we all know that when European settlers came over, so did the European missionaries with the intent of converting the uncivilized people to Christianity to, save our souls. At this time, I do not know the traditional name of this small mountain, which is fitting because traditional knowledge being lost is a common theme throughout this video. But what this place was eventually called, and is still called to this day, is Mission Hill. I was taught that this became called Mission Hill because it eventually became a common roadway for these missionaries to travel from their settlement community, which is literally now called Dollar Settlement. And that's where some of the missionaries were housed and they practiced there. But of course, not all of the missionaries that traveled to Bay Mills came from that area. But those missionaries would travel here to Gnoje-Conning to visit my ancestors and basically convince them that our ways were heathenistic and that Christianity would save their souls. The trail that I'm standing on leads to that community, and the other side leads down the ridge towards Gnoje-Conning. Aside from where we now bury our dead, there's a cemetery right behind me. This spot is also significant because later on, when the boarding school era came around, scouts called Indian agents would travel to Native communities and sometimes convince parents to send their children to boarding schools, but most of the time they forced parents to send their children, or they just blatantly kidnapped the children. Mission Hill became a place for parents to hide their children from these Indian agents. No one lives up here anymore, but there used to be residences up here, deep in the woods, and that's where parents could hide their children. However, there are several stories throughout the continent of North America of Indian agents showing up unannounced, and the same is true for my individual community. I've heard so many stories of parents teaching their children that when they see those Indian agents showing up on wagons or boat or whatever they showed up in to their community, that when they seen those Indian agents, that they needed to run, and they taught their children where to run to. Now, I don't know for sure, but I imagine that the same is true for my community. I imagine that the kids probably ran up here as well to escape Indian agents, or they just ran into the deep woods that surrounded our community. It's truly insane to look down at this direction, looking at this path and visualizing scared parents walking, sometimes running their children on this trail to escape from people taking them and bringing them to a place where they either wouldn't see them for years or they wouldn't see them ever again. And those scared parents are my family.
And so are those children. If you ask just about any Native person in North America about Indian schools, more than likely you'll be met with accounts of their personal experiences or the experiences of their family members. They can probably take you for a walk on their lands and point at areas that are significant to them, much like I just did. On the other hand, you may also be met with an unwillingness to share these stories, or you'll be told, I don't know, because their family before them were unwilling to talk to them about life at school. Despite Indian schools being common knowledge for Indigenous peoples, the remainder of the North American population typically isn't educated on the subject well or at all. Many non-Native people have no idea that these schools even existed, or they may have heard about these schools but still don't know that these schools inflicted traumas on the majority of the Native children who attended, and the deep, lasting effects of these schools that remain visible today. This video is going to cover Indian schools on the North American continent, although I would like to recognize here that there are Indigenous people around the world who went through similar experiences and policies enforced by the governments occupying their territories. This will be a generalized focus on North American Indian schools, with small glimpses of my community's experience. Attentions will be paid toward the involvement of the United States and Canadian governments, as well as their relevant officials, policies, and ideas. I'm not going to go into full detail of every act and policy that were passed through the United States and Canadian governments, because each history is long enough to have warranted entire videos that already exist on YouTube. Knowing the details of the several slow government actions isn't completely necessary in order to understand what happened with Indian schools, but there are many resources available online that can map out those timelines if you're interested. The research in this video was conducted by me. Sources will be cited in the description, most with links, as well as ways to support the Tk'emlúps community after their recent heartbreaking discovery of the unmarked mass grave of at least 215 children at Kamloops Indian School. I will also have timestamps listed for each segment of the video. Here I am also issuing a trigger warning for physical, emotional, and sexual violence against children. There will be details shared of some of the acts committed against Indigenous children, but I will provide another trigger warning before sharing, as well as providing timestamps so you know what time you can skip the video to. With that being said, let's talk about Indian schools. What are Indian schools? There were different types of Indian schools throughout the continent. Our main focus today are the total institutions where students lived in the schools, commonly referred to as Indian boarding schools in the United States and Indian residential schools in Canada. Whatever you may call them, each term refers to the same schools and can be used interchangeably. Ideally, students leave home to live at the boarding schools during the semester, returning home for breaks. We'll learn later in this video that that often wasn't the case. The other type of Indian school is the day school. These were small local schools that children would attend during the day and then return home to their families in the evening. These schools are not the main focus in the video, but I will say here that day schools did inflict traumas as well. They were often shoddy, inadequate buildings and hired abusive staff to carry out Indian education with the same intent that the boarding schools had. And day schools were just as involved in cultural genocide as boarding and residential schools were. Indian schools focused on three main parts of education: Christian religion, the English language, and industrial vocational training, which was often gendered. Where were Indian schools? Some schools were on reservation schools or off reservation schools. The definition is rather self-explanatory. They were either built on the reservation land or they were far away and children had to travel to the schools. Obviously, day schools always had to be somewhat near the children, but many children traveled far for boarding schools, sometimes across the continent.
Genocide or Bay Mills is one of the schools that eventually got an on-reservation school. There were other government schools in the area that in present day would be considered close by, but back then were inaccessible to Bay Mills children. After a few attempts of schools in shoddy buildings, the longest lasting one was here. The school was a government-funded mission school that children only attended during the day, but of course it was intertwined with a local church as all Indian schools focused on Christianity. At the time, Bay Mills had two churches. They had a Catholic church and they also had a Methodist church, which stood right about there. The school was run by that Methodist church until they both closed in 1941. Although I'm not sure if I'm sitting directly on the ground that the school stood on, I do know that it is in this area, whether I am to the left or to the right by 50 feet or less. The school ran from the early 20th century to 1941. After that, children attended the school at the local border town until another one opened up in 2003, which stands right over there, which your girl happened to be in the first graduating class. It is worth noting that many Bay Mills children still attended boarding schools, whether it was before the Methodist church school opened or it was during the life of the school, the day school here. So Bay Mills kids attended boarding schools either because we didn't have a day school yet or because they chose the boarding schools instead. But I do want to note that I have seen, photographs of the kids who attended the day school here, and I do know that their parents are the ones who went to boarding schools. So this community is still heavily affected by boarding schools, despite having a day school that ran here for, I don't really know, 30 years. Children from Bay Mills typically attended the Mount Pleasant boarding school, which is in the Lower Peninsula of Michigan. Other than that, they attended the Carlisle School in Pennsylvania and the Haskell School, which is in Kansas. In fact, I have found school records of Bay Mills children enrolled in these schools. But of course, around here, Bay Mills families have their own pictures and stories.
Indian schools were funded by the government and operated by churches. They were typically established via treaties between the federal and native governments, in which the federal government promised to educate native children. Or they were established by facilitators of the discovery doctrine, masquerading as do-gooders. who convinced Congress or Parliament to build a school basically where they wanted one. Which leads me to the why. Why did some Native nations ask the federal government to educate their children? Why did settler pseudo-philanthropists work so hard to build and establish schools? Well, each of them had the same desire to educate Native children using European technologies and methods. The intentions of each party, however, differed. Native nations who signed these treaties often viewed it as a good thing for Native children to learn the skills and languages of the European settlers in addition to their traditional skills. Although I personally think that we should remember that this was most likely the opinions of the nation's leaders being represented rather than the collective, as many parents did not agree that European education was necessary for their children. On the other hand, many Native parents did value European education and sent their children to these schools unaware of exactly what would transpire there. But settlers and their governments had other intentions. The historical time frames differed between the United States and Canada, but nonetheless, they came to similar conclusions. Indians were in the way of westward expansion, and previous methods of getting them out of the way weren't working. The idea that natives were in the way was called the Indian problem, and settlers were trying to find solutions to that problem. And oh, were their proposed solutions ever tested. We won't dive too deeply into these as it is a long history that is out of the scope of this video, but it's important to know that the Indian boarding school system was influenced by these other solutions. Examples of these include war, especially in the plains, attempted genocide, killing natives into extinction, displacement, pushing natives off their resourceful lands and onto barren lands, starvation, cutting off native food supplies, such as killing buffalo into near extinction or arresting native fishermen, and many strategies to push assimilation, including Christian missionary work, establishing praying towns, land allotment policies, and basically trying to convince natives to be suit-wearing farmers that live in four-wall cabins. While these methods were not one after the other, rather they took place simultaneously and were continuous over time, they did not work. They couldn't win the wars. They also wanted the lands they were pushing us onto, and they couldn't kill us all off. So there lies the logic then. If we can't beat them, then make them join us. But they couldn't convince us to assimilate, and the failure of assimilation policies proved it was too difficult to force native adults to assimilate. So, if you can't force an old dog to do new tricks, then it would probably make more sense to get the puppies to do your tricks, right? That's when figures such as Richard Henry Pratt of the United States and Egerton Ryerson of Canada stepped forward. Now, I have tried looking for connections between these two, but all I could find were after the fact. I could not find evidence that Pratt took ideas from Ryerson or that Ryerson took ideas from other actors in the United States, as Ryerson's career in education took place 30 years before Pratt's. There is evidence, however, of people in each country bouncing ideas off the other, such as the Davin Report in 1879. Where Canada Prime Minister John Macdonald sent Nicholas Flood Davin to the U.S. to learn more about the aggressive assimilation of children being practiced here. There were many influential people throughout the years involved with developing the idea of targeting Native children. Pratt and Ryerson are credited as the spearheads for Indian education in their respective countries. Ryerson, a militant Christian turned superintendent of education, and Pratt, a military captain who experimented with assimilating his Apache prisoners, both arrived at the conclusion that the best way to assimilate Native peoples was to separate the children from their families and make the European lifestyle the only lifestyle they could ever know. Kill the Indian in him and save the man. Ryerson was the superintendent of education for the Upper Province of Canada, where he wrote policy on several education systems. He is credited with making Canada's schools available to the public, but at the time, he intended public schools for white, able-bodied children. Disabled children, black children, and Indigenous children were to be segregated and receive their own respective standards of education. Although Ryerson did not open the first residential school, as it was opened before he ever took office, he wrote a report in 1847 containing a design for an Indian residential schooling system. His design became Canada's overall blueprint for Indian education, as well as the official policy that it would be mandatory for Native families to send their children or they would face consequences. Pratt thought he was taking a more humane approach by educating Native children better than black children, by his standards. He had originally brought Natives to a school for black children and didn't like that school's methods, so he eventually started the Carlisle Indian School in Pennsylvania in 1879, the first and largest off-reservation Indian boarding school in the United States. He designed the school to have a corporal environment. It was prison-like, as it was converted from an old military base, guards were hired, and it was a total institution where the children's day-to-day lives were completely controlled. Behavior policies were military-like, and discipline was designed with corporal punishment at the forefront. Carlisle became the blueprint for all other Indian schools across the country, as the rest of them followed suit. And this was the type of aggressive assimilation Canada studied via the Davin Report. Fast forward in time, and eventually several more schools were erected throughout the lands, some long-lasting, some temporary. Canada facilitated over 140 residential schools in total, with 80 schools being the highest number operated at one time. Most of the last schools closed around the 1970s, but some were taken over by First Nations. The last residential school to remain open was closed in 1996. Over 150,000 children attended these schools from 1831 to 1996. The United States facilitated over 350 boarding schools overall. In 1895, there were 157 boarding schools with 150,000 students and 125 day schools with 3,000 students. This number may not sound that large to the contemporary ear, but the total Native population in the United States in 1895 was about 248,000. Considering the ratio, one would be inclined to believe that nearly all Native children were attending these schools. 1895 was not the peak of boarding school numbers, however, because as the population of Natives grew, so did the enrollment of school pupils. In the 1920s, Indian schools began closing in order to integrate Native children into public schools. Around the 60s and 70s, Native nations began taking over remaining schools, and 64 of them are still open today. One example of this is the Haskell Indian School, which is now a university for Natives. Many institutions in the U.S. are associated with Indian schools, such as the Old Moors Charity School, eventually turning into Dartmouth College. Perhaps some of you are thinking, but Chelsea, why are you telling us the numbers of Indigenous children enrolled in schools in the United States and Canada as if it's a bad thing to go to school? Indian schools, especially the residential schools, were not anything like schools today. They were not a simple cultural shift for Indigenous peoples. They were one of the biggest contributors to the cause of the near death of Indigenous cultures that are only still here because of small generational whisper networks. The United States and Canada were both pleased by the effectiveness their Indian schooling systems had in civilizing the Indians, and thus solving the Indian problem. So much so that numerous reports were issued and letters corresponded throughout the years and across the lands where officials detailed the success of their schools. Before and after photo shoots were had of students in order to demonstrate that the schools were effectively assimilating Native peoples. Educating the Native child population in these schools was successfully forming them into assimilated adults in their eyes. But in these children's eyes and in the Native population's eyes, these schools eradicated our cultures under the guise of a generous offer to introduce more skills to natives. I will have more to say about cultural genocide, but I want to say here that it isn't the only issue with the schools. Abuse, death, and trauma that has been passed all the way down to generations being born now are all also offenses against Indigenous peoples that were committed by the United States and Canada. This is what happens when ethnocentric nations gain such power over people that they view as subhuman.
Well, I did have the opportunity to talk to my grandma about it, and she was very quiet about it. She never really talked about it. She was born on December 5th of 1897, and at that time they had a homestead, and her mom and dad were both Native American, and so he was too young at the time to get into the allotment.
Mm-hmm.
So after, all these children that should have had land are now landless. So there was a Homestead Act, so he got that. So that's where she was born. They were only spoke Ojibwe. They didn't speak English in the family. Grandma was 3 years old, and she was chosen, and she was being trained to be the medicine woman by her aunt, Charlotte. On January 4th of 1904, her mother was going into labor, having twins. And her dad had just broken his leg up on the top. And he was in a box cast. That's what they did back in 1904. And he wasn't allowed to move. So my grandma Anna had placenta previa. And to get to the hospital, it was a 20-mile in a buggy. And there was a medicine woman on scene, but there was nothing they could do. Grandma and the babies died. So now we have these children in the home up in Brimley, and Grandpa can't get up out of bed because of his broken leg. And Grandma told my sister Wanda this story, that she remembers she was 5 years old, 5, 6, 7 years old at the time, and she said she remembers a horse and buggy pulling up to their house and putting the children in the buggy, and she thought they were going on a picnic.
So did they intimidate her dad to send her? Was it?
Oh, he didn't send her. They kidnapped her.
They just came and
They just came and took her. So, and they did that with all the children here. When the government was coming in, people would know, so the word would get spread really fast and catch, before, hide your children, they're coming. So a lot of them had a hiding spot under the stairs and put the kids up there to hide them. And then some of them went up into Mission Hill, up into the forest, and hid the kids. So, and that's what they had to do. And our family was one of the ones that, because Grandpa was laid up, Grandma just died, and there was he couldn't move, he couldn't get up. They were taken, put on the train that was up in Brimley, and shipped to Mount Pleasant boarding school. So here she is, a little over 6, going into a boarding school. She was immediately separated from, the girls and the boys, her brothers. She was, they were stripped of their clothes. They were washed in some kerosene. The boys were shaven, all their hair was gone. You have these little kids who don't speak English. So Grandma tells a story that she was locked in a closet and she was starved and she was beaten because she didn't know how to speak English. She got shipped from the Mount Pleasant, and then she went to the Carlisle boarding school, and then they shipped her to the Haskell, where at 21 she finally was able to go home. As I said, I got to live with Grandma, and she never talked about it, and she never talked anything private to any of us, not just little spurts here and there. But I did. One day we were eating breakfast, and the radio was playing, and the Gordon Lightfoot song came on, the Edmund Fitzgerald.
Yeah.
And Grandma's eating, and she just starts giggling. And I says, "What's funny, Grandma?" And she goes, "Get you goomy." And I goes, "What, is that not how you say it?" She goes, "No." And I goes, "Well, how do you say it?" She goes, "It's get you goomy." I goes, "Oh." I goes, "They must have not had a word to rhyme with it." And so, and it's like, "Grandma, can you speak Ojibwe?" She goes, "I don't speak it, but I know what's being said." And I goes, "Well, how come you never taught Mom?" She goes, "My girl, I never wanted my children or my grandchildren to go through what I did." I said, "Oh, okay." So that's why everything was lost in our family. Here we have, she only spoke Ojibwe, being trained to be the medicine woman, and it was all taken from us. Her brothers were treated, bad too, and we have several letters that they sent the police out looking for Grandma's younger brother, Uncle Alex. He would always run away because the conditions and that were bad there. At one point, he's over 18 years old. And they found him and they brought him back. And finally, between 18 to 21, gave up that, quit trying to chase him and, search for him. So, and his story is, he ended up living in Grand Rapids. And he married and had 2 children. And he went to work. And it was at the time the Ku Klux Klan was really bad down there. And they have his lunchbox where he ate his lunch. And he was never seen again. And I had the privilege of living with my grandma, Lucy, when, before she passed. And she told me that, she says it was never proven, but they knew that the Ku Klux Klan got him, and he was never heard from again. A lot of the children heavily got into alcohol, because they didn't know how to live once they got back here. Now they're being raised for 15 to 20 years with no love, no affection. What does that do to a child? Even today, that child's going to be hurt and scarred. So and it did happen to Grandma's brothers. Some of them were very scarred. I don't know why, but Grandma, for some reason, did not get scarred like, her siblings did. She was very loving, but, too, and not all the children that were taken came back. Out of all the siblings, of Grandma's, only 2 came back. One ended up out in California. One ended up in Pennsylvania. One down in Grand Rapids. Well, he went missing. One down in Detroit. But they never came back home. And so that happened to a lot of the natives from this area. They didn't come home. They didn't feel they had that connection anymore, which is very sad, very sad.
In 1891, the United States issued the policy of compulsory attendance, which made school attendance mandatory for Native children. And in 1894 Canada, compulsory attendance was pushed through an amendment to the Indian Act. However, the pressure for Native parents to send their children to schools existed long before it became mandatory in each country, and the several tactics that had been used to enforce compliance continued. Indian agents demanded a census of children from tribal villages. Parents would often lie on these censuses to keep their children off the grid, and Indian agents knew that, so they would investigate these villages and send police forces, such as the RCMP, to essentially hunt the children. Other policies targeting Native peoples included forcing us onto reservations and cutting off our ability to gather our traditional diets, which in turn forced us to rely on food rations from the federal government or starve. Parents would either be denied their food rations if they did not send their children to school, or their food rations were too little to support a family, so sending the kids to school was the only way everyone could eat. So if this type of coercion didn't work, then brute force would be applied. Agents would show up unexpectedly and kidnap the children before anyone had time to prepare or hide them. Sometimes parents were unable to protect their children, like in Lucy's case. Parents would even be beaten or have their lives threatened, and I'm sure some lives were even taken. Later on came an era known as the 60s scoop, beginning in the 1950s, mostly taking place in the 1960s, but still continues to this day behind a thin veil and is now referred to as the Millennium Scoop. It's the practice of scooping up Native children and adopting them out to white families. We won't get too deep into the scoops, but many children did end up at boarding schools instead of with families. Not all families were coerced or forced, however. Schools used propaganda as well as using former students as posters of success in order to convince Native families that the schools were enjoyable and beneficial. Students such as Jim Thorpe. Some children thought going to school would make them warriors or honorable in other ways. Overall, children of all ages were in these schools, mostly 5 to 18-year-old children, but toddlers and babies, as well as young adults, were at these schools. I'm sure there were other strategies for taking Indigenous children that I have not mentioned here, but there are too many ways to express how incredibly traumatic and damaging it was for each child to be separated from their parents. Our parents are our source of comfort, stability, and everything else we must depend on them for, and they were separated from them during their most formative years. Children often didn't understand what was even happening, sometimes even believing that their parents didn't want them anymore, or that they were being sent away for being bad. It is no secret that Pratt et al. Designed every first moment at the schools to have purpose. Cut their hair, strip their clothes, rename them with Christian names, forbid native languages, and immediately immerse them into environments with strict rules and fierce punishments. These schools, including Mount Pleasant Boarding School, where many in my family attended, would scrub the children upon arrival, teaching them that they were dirty and filthy. They scrubbed the children with alcohol, DDT, and kerosene. Kerosene, a light fuel obtained by distilling petroleum, used especially in jet engines and domestic heaters and lamps, and as a cleaning solvent. We have to remember some of these actions might not seem significant to many today, but at the time were devastating experiences. Getting your hair cut off was incredibly traumatic because of the significance of hair. Tribes had sacred teachings about hair, such as it being an extension of your spirit or it being a message of status or politic. Many children felt humiliated by having their hair cut because some tribes cut hair as a punishment and or message that the person was exiled from their tribe, usually for a crime. These schools purposely ripped every single thing from Native children in order to completely remove them from their culture and shift their entire worlds into a European perspective. Pratt considered this practice to be that of a baptism. Like other cultural practices, native languages were also banned, but enforcing this ban wasn't as simple as cutting off hair. Enforcing the language ban, as well as several strict rules, which had unrealistic standards for the children to adhere to, was done through corporal punishment. I'm sure most of us have heard of teachers back in the day whacking kids with rulers, but I want you, the viewer, to understand that I am not exaggerating when I say Native children were beaten at these schools. And they were often brutally beaten for violating impossible rules and for slightly stepping out of uniform. The belief was to spare the rod was to spoil the child. Other cruel forms of punishment were employed as well, some of which were common among several schools and some were unique to the school. For example, some schools had an underground hole or closet or some other form of solitary confinement that was absolutely terrifying to the children. Some schools used an electric chair. Some forced children to eat their own vomit or spoiled food. Some schools even forced children to participate in punishing their classmates. Belt lines would be formed, where the children would assemble into 2 lines, remove their belts, and be instructed to whip the child in question as they ran between the lines. They would also be encouraged to humiliate classmates when they were in trouble. And by giving the children a small amount of power over their classmates in these situations, children grew more desensitized to the emotional needs of others. Brutal punishment was not the only damaging thing about these schools. In fact, there were several things that went wrong. Sexual abuse was rampant across the continent. Firstly, the staff abused the children, the priests, the nuns, and other staff. Some schools were more secretive about it, with staff sneaking away children into bathrooms or inviting them to stay alone after class. Other schools were more organized, with priests taking children from their beds at night or orchestrating an initiation type of tradition where priests would assault boys for their 13th birthday. Then the abuse turned into a cycle as the children began sexually abusing other children, either because some victims were traumatized from being assaulted or some victims were so young when it happened to them that they were convinced it was normal behavior. About 1 in 5 children in Canada were sexually assaulted. There are no estimates for the United States that I could find, but it is known to also be a gross amount as well. It is worth noting that these are likely low estimates, as sexual abuse was often unreported and many victims took their experiences to their graves. Malnutrition was a huge problem. This was due to schools not having enough food due to low budgets or money being spent on frivolous things instead of food. Not being fed enough was often worsened due to starvation being another method of punishment. The living conditions were bad. On one hand, there were strict rules with severe punishments, but on the other hand, there was a lack of supervision that resulted in bullying and abuse. The infrastructure was often unsuitable to house so many children, resulting in extreme temperatures, poor sanitation, and overcrowding. All of this, combined with lack of disease prevention, aggravated the prevalence of diseases. Tuberculosis was widespread among schools, as well as trachoma, the Spanish flu, smallpox, measles, and mumps. Not only did conditions fuel the spread of disease, but the health care for children was abysmal. There was no effort towards early detection of disease. In fact, it would often take several months to a year before children were diagnosed with diseases, even if they displayed symptoms. Once diagnosed, they would either be shipped back home to infect their families, receive inadequate treatment for their disease, or no course of action would have been taken at all. Besides disease, healthcare in general was poor, and in some schools, children were even being experimented on without their consent. These experiments included, but are not limited to, nutrition and diet supplement experiments, vaccine trials, effects of certain chemicals on humans, vision experiments, or they were denied treatments to study disease progression. Not only were children exploited for medical science, but they were also exploited for money and services. Schools often had tight budgets, so they would enlist the children for various services and collect the money earned. Boys were often hired out for farming and agricultural work, and girls were hired out to families and households for domestic service, which unfortunately led to many children being injured or killed in accidents or assaulted by their employers. What is notably twisted is children were commissioned by the schools to create crafts from their cultures for the schools to sell, the very crafts that children were beaten to leave behind. Whether it be crafts or other services of production, children were typically given heavy quotas and were punished if they failed to meet them. At this point, you might be wondering why these children didn't leave if conditions were so terrible. There are many reasons they didn't or couldn't leave. Compulsory attendance and coercion tactics were definitely the key ways children were pushed into schools, but of course there was other wickedness going on. Children who would beg to go home would be told lies that their parents didn't want them or that their families were dead. Incoming and outgoing letters were all heavily scrutinized. If parents wrote that they wanted to visit or take their children home, the letters would either be withheld and destroyed, or the schools would respond on the child's behalf, claiming that the child was happy and doing well. If children wrote a letter asking to leave, not only would the school refuse to send the letter, but the child would sometimes even be punished for writing such things. Many children felt they had no choice but to run away. Canada's RCMP and the local United States police forces would always chase deserters, and they would be brutally punished after being caught and returned to the school. Oftentimes, children were unaware just how far from home they were or how uninhabitable the lands surrounding the school were.
There were 3 boys that ran away from this school. They wanted to go home. There are 3 brothers, and they were from Nashchitty. They ran away from here as winter, January. They did find the boys after a while, but the sad part is all 3 boys lost their legs due to frostbite, frozen legs. So they did come back to school here, but they were in wheelchairs, and then later on they went to the fake legs, but they were, they still finished here with us.
The most severe consequence above all the bad conditions previously mentioned was death, and death is intertwined with everything I've talked about so far. Beatings and assaults were sometimes so severe that they caused death. Malnutrition, disease, poor health, experimentation, accidents from work, accidents during school-facilitated outings, suicide, neglect, and succumbing to the environment while running away were all things that contributed to the deaths of Native children. Infanticide also occurred at these schools, where girls would become pregnant after being assaulted, and staff would then murder their babies in order to hide sexual abuse or because the school refused to help the girl care for the baby. The common method for killing the babies was to burn them alive in the furnace. As if this couldn't get any worse, there was no respect for the victims or their families. Schools would refuse to send their bodies to their home communities to save money, instead burying them in graveyards on school grounds and not allowing families to hold services there. In many cases, fellow classmates were ordered to complete the burials. As we've recently seen at Kamloops, but Native communities have always known, are the unmarked graves of children who have been considered missing by their families, graves that are often mass graves. Families would not be told that their children had passed away. Parents would be completely ignored by the school and forever searching for their children, or the school would lie to them, claiming the children were happy and had simply moved to another school or town. Schools sought to cover up these deaths, but survivors remember who went missing, that mass graves were formed, and sometimes they remember where the mass graves are. The rates of death in the United States in Canadian boarding residential schools were profound. In the United States, Preston McBride of Dartmouth College recorded over 1,000 deaths, but due to missing children and suspicions of mass cover-ups, he estimates that around 40,000 children died either in or because of these institutions. Canada's Truth and Reconciliation report documented over 6,000 deaths, but again, estimated that there is much more to uncover.
Number of children who died was a significant number, and we think that we have not uncovered anywhere near what the total would be, because the record keeping around that question was very poor. Dr. Peter Bryce, who was the chief medical officer for the department in the early part of the 20th century, estimated that between 24 and 42% of children died at the school or shortly after leaving the school.
So how many kids would that be?
Well, if you estimate that at any given point in time there were probably 5,000 to 10,000 children in the schools across the country, that's a huge number. And if we had a system today where the children were dying at that rate in the schools, they would never be tolerated.
Sinclair's and Preston's interviews took place in 2015 and 2013, respectively, before ground-penetrating radar began being used as a tool for discovering graves, and their suspicions raised are now beginning to be proven true. At this moment, I've been working on this video for a month now, and more stories keep developing. It is currently June 28, 2021. Since 215 children were found in late May, over 1,000 more children were found, including 751 at just one school. Groups in Canada are currently looking at more schools, but as far as I know, there hasn't been much physical movement in the United States as of yet. Deb Haaland, Secretary of Interior, has called for an investigation into United States boarding schools. Poor conditions and high death rates were not uncovered only recently. There is evidence that the United States and Canadian governments, as well as the schools, knew back then that the schools were causing deaths. In Canada, Dr. Peter Bryce, medical inspector for the Department of Indian Affairs, wrote in his 1907 report that 7% in the schools he surveyed are sick or in poor health, and 24% are reported dead. He cited the infrastructure of the schools as the main contributing factor to death. As their fix-it response to this report, the DIA hired Duncan Campbell Scott as the head of Indian education, whose response to Bryce's criticisms was, Indian children in the residential schools die at a much higher rate than in their villages, but this does not justify a change in the policy of this department, which is geared towards a final solution of our Indian problem. Throughout the continent, there are correspondence letters between school and government officials that are evidence they were aware that conditions were a problem, but they shared attitudes that preventing disease and death of Native children was not worth the expense. For example, a medical expert in 1936 claimed that it was pointless to educate Indian children if they were likely to be blinded by trachoma. Hundreds of thousands of children attended these schools, children with their own stories that are now held by their families, children whose stories died with them, children who went to hundreds of different schools that had their own ways of doing things. Therefore, there is no universal boarding school experience, but what everyone does share is the overall impact boarding schools had on our cultures and our communities, an impact that is still very visible today. Although there are still issues that exist in contemporary schooling systems for Native children, the main boarding residential school era has passed. The children graduated and grew up, the schools closed, and time went on. Unfortunately, the traumas inflicted by these schools did not only take place in their buildings, and those traumas did not end with the era. First, let's declare here what a massive failure the schools were. There is a lot of documentation that school faculty and government officials mostly expressed their goals as seeking to civilize Native children. Rarely did they express wanting to genuinely teach skills they claimed Native children needed. Therefore, the main thing that occurred at these schools was not education, rather it was a loss of identity. Survivors of these schools did not gain anything from these schools, they only lost. The training that students did receive, training that resembled slavery and sickness more than it did the application of skills, was always menial training. Native children were taught skills intended for low-class jobs. And here are 3 problems with their training. 1. Schools intended children to enter the dominant society, but many opted to return home to their communities and reservations. The training they received at school ended up being wasted skills. They could not apply industrial training at home. The skills they did need for living and contributing to their communities were not taught at these schools. Therefore, their families were disappointed and sometimes even constantly expressed frustration with their children. Sometimes communities even disowned them because they were no longer, quote unquote, one of us. Many children had to learn a way of living, completely wasting their school-learned skills, or they sadly moved to urban areas. 2. Racism made it difficult for Native people to get work they were trained for or be safe in the towns and cities. And 3. The jobs they were trained for did not pay well, so industrially trained natives living in urban areas were often impoverished. Although many children returned to their homes, many did make urban areas their first choice, leaving their homes behind and often leaving their native identities behind. Many married non-native partners and raised their children without any of their culture or connection to their home. But loss of culture and language happened both in the towns and cities and at home in native communities. Survivors either forgot their languages and customs or never learned any of it in the first place. Survivors couldn't teach language and customs to subsequent generations because doing so was a trigger for their PTSD. Survivors would internalize the racist and negative things they were taught in school, effectively believing those things about themselves, that they were dirty, they were uncivilized, indigenous spiritualities were evil, and that learning language and culture was regressing. This internalized racism, combined with several traumatic events at school, resulted in an epidemic of mental illness, post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety, depression, and other mental illnesses plagued survivors of boarding residential schools, and the rates were catastrophic. Survivors' responses to trauma from their school experiences and the mental illness they derived from that manifested into other issues that continue to be aggravated by racism and poverty. There began high rates of suicide among school survivors, and some survivors were institutionalized. Substance abuse became a problem that still exists in our communities today. Some developed substance abuse issues to cope with trauma and or by being exposed to the substance abuse of their relatives and community members. Substance abuse became a cycle as subsequent generations began using as a means of coping or simply living. Physical, psychological, and sexual abuse continued as a problem. A brief explanation before I make my main point here. Parenting is mostly learned by observing one's own parents and relatives as role models, and when one becomes a parent, one then applies what they learned through that lifetime of observations. Being that Native children spent their most formative years in schools, they did not have any parenting role models to observe. What had replaced their parents was neglect and physical, psychological, and sexual abuse. Children also did not receive love, so they didn't know how to love. Or, in many cases, they developed a warped sense of love due to being sexually abused. Therefore, another side effect of boarding schools was many survivors applying what they know to their parenting, which was neglect and abuse, and not knowing how to parent or love their children. Victims went on to victimize others, and it eventually became a cycle affecting multiple generations of Native people. These cycles of trauma and trauma responses being passed from generation to generation are referred to as intergenerational trauma or historical trauma. But historical trauma is not only passed through abuse cycles or social problems, it also manifests in 2 other ways. First, historical trauma is explained as our connection to our ancestors in the past and how we, as descendants, experience their suffering in the present time, basically asserting that subsequent generations experience symptoms caused by sympathizing with our ancestors. Other simpler areas of study have theories similar to the nature of the historical trauma theory, such as non-pregnant partners experiencing pregnancy symptoms due to subconsciously sympathizing with their pregnant partner, or the phenomenon of yawning when you see someone else yawn. However, I would like to argue that historical trauma for Indigenous peoples digs deeper than subconsciously sympathizing. I think because our cultures and spiritualities involve the constant maintenance of a close connection with our ancestors, it's more like we're empathizing rather than sympathizing or feeling the experience ourselves. Unlike the dominant society, it is common for Indigenous peoples to not view our ancestors as distant people we don't know who we happen to descend from. Rather, they are the fibers in our fabric. They are us, and we are them. Hopefully that explains how and why historical trauma manifests in subsequent generations. Second, there is evidence that historical trauma physically passes to generations through our DNA and our neurobiology essentially being scarred and our children inheriting those scars. Basically, what this is saying is that when a person experiences a traumatic event, they experience permanent changes to the gene that works with neurotransmitters responsible for stress and mood. Being that we inherit half of our DNA from each parent, it is possible for us to inherit a copy of our parents' scarred gene, which in turn affects how we experience stress and mood. Without getting way deep into epigenetics, because, well, I'm not a scientist and that's beyond the scope of this video, I do want to note here that this is a theory that has, yes, been studied with real samples of Native peoples. But also, it 100% does not apply to every Native person. Not everyone's genes are affected, and affected genes are not always expressed. I just want to make that clear before I have people discussing race science in the comments. While we can't physically see our genes, what is visible and right in front of us is the loss of culture, customs, and language. Many Native languages are extinct or near extinction. Many natives are unenrolled in their tribes for various reasons, which is also an issue for tribes because their enrollment numbers are low. Many ceremonies and teachings have been lost or are difficult to access. Much knowledge continues to die off as our elders pass on. For many, but not all, family systems and community connectedness has been lost as many Native communities assimilated into the nuclear family. And with that, traditional familial roles were lost as well. Some cultural changes led to social problems. Matriarchal and egalitarian societies assimilated into the dominant patriarchal society, resulting in sexism, toxic masculinity, and other aspects of Euro society most Native cultures didn't otherwise have. Cultures lost their traditional regard for non-hetero and non-binary people who exist under the LGBT+ umbrella today, resulting in homophobia, transphobia, and the loss of ceremony for and sacredness of those people. Traditional customs of group identity and politics were lost, resulting in colorism and lateral violence, especially towards mixed natives. I'm sure there are many other issues caused by the boarding residential school era that I have not covered here, and to be honest, I could really elaborate more on everything that I've talked about, but because the current topic is the discoveries of mass graves at residential schools, I do want to make the connection between the death of Indigenous children at these schools and genocide. Tens of thousands of Native children died unnecessarily at the hands of these schools. I want you to remember that each child loss is the loss of an entire family line. I learned just last week after discussing these schools with my aunt that my great-grandfather Harold, who passed when I was 2, her dad, went to a boarding school. He and my great-grandmother Marie, who I knew until she passed when I was 28, had 10 children, and most of those children went on to have families of their own. What if he didn't survive school? There would be at least 150 fewer Anishinaabe alive today, never born. Now, imagine how much of the Indigenous population in North America was thwarted due to tens of thousands of children dying. Tell me that's not genocide. We know Canada and the United States know this is genocide. If they thought otherwise, they wouldn't protect the abusers that worked at these schools, and they would release the records victims' families have been begging for. One issue that plagues efforts by Natives to talk about our history and what we go through is the fact that videos like this easily turn into trauma porn, or it depicts Native peoples as always suffering. It may feed stereotypes that we were all impoverished, all abusive to each other, and all abusing substances. It should be common sense that talking about high rates doesn't equal everyone. And talking about statistics of things like substance abuse or domestic abuse within Indian country often quickly turns into blaming and criminalizing Indian country, rather than focusing on who and what caused these problems in our communities in the first place. It also often results in Native people who do suffer from substance abuse or other issues being classified as undesirables that we should dump and avoid, rather than human beings who need help with their trauma. This is not trauma porn, and Indigenous peoples are not helpless. Over time, we have been identifying issues in our communities and have been working on combating them. We are launching community programs for things like substance abuse and mental health. We are creating our own economies. We are sharing knowledge. We are bringing ceremonies back. And we are not staying quiet. We have been and continue to talk about our grievances and demand change, and we continue to start new conversations as time goes on. We are still in the thick of these things, but they are happening. It grows increasingly ironic, the fact that boarding residential schools sought to civilize us through the English language and religion. They did not realize that teaching us how to speak and read English also taught us to read and understand treaties and Indian law and demand what was promised to us. They did not realize that grouping tribes together made us even more connected to each other. They did not realize that the atrocities they committed against us caused fear that eventually grew into strength. We have lost a lot, but we have not lost everything.